Before the world called it France, this land was a mosaic of forests, rivers, and wind-swept plains. It was a world that existed long before the word nation had meaning, when people measured the earth by mountains and stars rather than by borders and flags. In this wild expanse of Western Europe, stretching from the Atlantic to the Rhine, from the Pyrenees to the Channel, the earliest humans hunted, gathered, and built small communities among the stones and valleys. Archaeologists have found traces of these first settlers: tools of flint, carvings of animals, painted caves whispering of a time when survival itself was a form of art. As the Ice Age receded, the rivers Loire, Seine, and Rhone shaped valleys where life flourished. Agriculture arrived from the south, brought by early farmers who tamed the soil and raised cattle. Over time, tribes began to form identities tied to their lands. By around 800 BC, the Celtic culture had spread across much of Europe, and what we now call France became known as Gaul. The people here spoke Celtic languages, worshipped gods of nature and war, and built fortified settlements called oppida, hilltop strongholds made of timber and stone. The Gauls were not one people but many. Dozens of tribes occupied the land, the Aedui, Arverni, Sequani, and Parisi among them. They traded with Greeks along the Mediterranean and with the distant islands of Britain. They minted coins, wore colorful woven fabrics, and valued courage above all. Warriors fought with long swords and fierce pride. Yet even in their rivalry, a shared culture tied them together. Their priests, known as Druids, held immense influence. They memorized laws, myths, and astronomy, guiding their people without written texts, for Druidic knowledge was sacred and never to be written down. By the 3rd century BC, traders from the Greek colony of Massalia, modern Marseille, sailed along the southern coast. Through trade came new goods, wine, ceramics, and ideas. The Gauls learned of distant lands, of Rome rising beyond the Alps. At first, the two worlds existed apart, connected only by merchants and curiosity. But as Rome grew stronger, its hunger for land drew it northward. The Alps, once a barrier, became a bridge for legions and ambition. In 125 BC, Roman generals crossed into southern Gaul, seeking to secure trade routes and allies. The tribes resisted fiercely, but Rome's discipline and iron formations proved unmatched. By 121 BC, the first Roman province in Gaul was established, Gallia Narbonensis. For the next century, Rome would watch the rest of Gaul with patience and a soldier's appetite. Then came the man who would change everything, Gaius Julius Caesar. In 58 BC, Caesar was appointed governor of the Roman provinces bordering Gaul. Officially, his mission was to protect Roman interests. In truth, he sought glory, power, and wealth. When migrating tribes known as the Helvetii attempted to move through Gaul, Caesar seized the opportunity to intervene. His legions, hardened and loyal, clashed with Celtic warriors who fought bravely but lacked unity. Tribe after tribe fell or surrendered. For nearly a decade, Caesar waged his campaigns across the land. He wrote about them in his Commentari de Bello Gallico, describing the battles and landscapes with precision and self-praise. His words remain one of the most detailed records of ancient Gaul. But behind those lines lies a story of immense suffering. Entire towns were destroyed, thousands enslaved, and fields burned to ensure submission. In 52 BC, resistance reached its peak under a young chieftain named Vercingetorix of the Arverni tribe. He united many Gauls under one banner, calling his people to defend their homeland. At the fortress of Alesia, surrounded by hills and forests, his warriors made a final stand. The siege lasted weeks. Caesar's forces built massive walls around the city to trap the defenders. When reinforcements failed, famine took hold. Vercingetorix surrendered to spare his people, laying down his sword at Caesar's feet, a moment both tragic and symbolic. Gaul became part of Rome. Over time, conquest gave way to assimilation. Roman roads and cities transformed the land. Latin replaced Celtic tongues, temples became basilicas, and Gaulish gods blended with Roman ones. Towns like Lugdunum, Lyon, Lutetia, Paris, and Bertigala, Bordeaux, grew into bustling centers of trade and culture. Roman baths, theaters, and forums brought a new rhythm to daily life. The once wild land of tribes became a province of empire. For nearly 5 centuries, Roman Gaul thrived. Vineyards stretched across hillsides, villas dotted the countryside, and trade flowed from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. The Gauls became Roman citizens, soldiers, scholars, and senators. Even as emperors rose and fell, Gaul remained a jewel in the empire's crown. Yet beneath the surface, identities endured. The memory of old tribes, languages, and gods never vanished completely. It lingered like whispers in the countryside. By the 3rd century AD, cracks began to appear in the Roman world. The empire, stretched across continents, faced invasions, economic troubles, and internal chaos. Germanic tribes along the Rhine grew bolder. In the north and east of Gaul, border towns faced repeated raids. Roman legions, once invincible, found themselves outnumbered and weary. Emperors came and went in rapid succession. In 406 AD, disaster struck. During a harsh winter, the Rhine River froze, and a massive wave of tribes, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, crossed into Roman territory. Cities burned, trade collapsed, and Roman authority crumbled. The empire tried to recover, but the tide of change could not be stopped. By the mid-5th century, Roman power in Gaul was a shadow of its former self. The legions withdrew. The governors lost control. In the chaos, a new people began to rise from the north, the Franks. Originally a confederation of Germanic tribes living near the lower Rhine, the Franks had long been both enemies and allies of Rome. Some fought as mercenaries, others settled within the empire's borders. They were pragmatic, fierce, and ambitious. As Rome weakened, they saw opportunity. One Frankish leader named Clovis emerged as a figure of destiny. Born around 466 AD, he inherited a small kingdom near modern Belgium. At first, his domain was modest, but his ambition was not. Through warfare, alliances, and cunning, he expanded his rule across much of northern Gaul. By defeating rival tribes and uniting the Franks, Clovis laid the foundations of a new kingdom, Francia. Clovis's greatest moment came not in battle but in belief. After victory against a rival Germanic tribe, he converted to Christianity, specifically to the Roman form practiced in Gaul. This choice was political genius. While many neighboring rulers followed Arian Christianity, which divided them from Rome, Clovis aligned himself with the powerful church and the surviving Gallo-Roman elite. His baptism in Reims, performed by Saint Remigius, symbolized more than faith. It marked the birth of a Christian kingdom that would endure for centuries. The old world of Gaul was gone, but its soul lived on within the new. The Latin spoken in Roman cities evolved slowly into the early French language. Roman laws blended with Frankish customs. The roads that legions once marched now carried merchants, monks, and messengers of a new faith. The map of Europe was changing once again, drawn not by emperors but by kings. By the time of Clovis's death in 511 AD, his realm stretched from the Pyrenees to the Rhine. He had transformed scattered tribes into a single kingdom. His successors, known as the Merovingians, would continue his legacy, though with growing intrigue and internal strife. But the foundation was laid. From ashes of empire, France had begun to take shape. In this transformation, we see the timeless rhythm of history, the fall of one world giving birth to another. The rivers of Gaul still flowed as they had for millennia, carrying reflections of forests, cities, and fortresses. Yet now they mirrored crosses, not idols, crowns, not helmets. The land remembered both. The story of France was no longer just about conquest. It was about survival, adaptation, and rebirth. As monks copied manuscripts in candle-lit rooms and farmers tilled soil over forgotten battlefields, a new identity emerged, part Roman, part Frankish, and entirely unique. In every church stone, in every road and ruin, echoes of ancient Gaul remained. The age of Rome had ended, but a new chapter of Europe had begun. When Clovis died in 501 AD, his kingdom was divided among his sons, as was the Frankish custom. Unity gave way to rivalry, and bloodline became both the source of legitimacy and conflict. The Merovingian kings who followed Clovis ruled vast lands, but were often consumed by internal disputes. Their long hair became a symbol of royal power, and their courts were filled with intrigue. As generations passed, true authority began to slip from the hands of kings into those of their most powerful officials, known as the mayors of the palace. These mayors, initially servants of the crown, grew to command armies and influence the destiny of the realm. Among them, one family from Austrasia, the northeastern region of the Frankish Kingdom, rose above all others. This was the house of the Carolingians. Their story began with Pepin of Herstal and his son, Charles Martel. Charles, whose name means the hammer, would shape the fate of Europe itself. In the year 732, as Muslim armies advanced into Western Europe after conquering Spain, they reached deep into Frankish territory. At the Battle of Tours, Charles Martel led his warriors against the invaders. The clash was fierce, and legend holds that the Frankish infantry stood firm like an unbreakable wall. When the dust settled, the Muslim advance was halted. Though modern historians debate the scale of the battle, its symbolic weight was immense. Charles was hailed as the defender of Christendom. His victory ensured that the heart of Europe would remain Christian, setting the stage for a new kind of empire to emerge. After Charles Martel's death, his son Pepin the Short inherited his power but not the royal title. The Merovingian kings still existed, but they ruled in name only, do-nothing kings, as chroniclers later called them. In 751, Pepin sought legitimacy to match his authority. He turned to the Pope in Rome and asked a question that would forever change European politics. If a king held no real power, was he truly a king? The Pope agreed that power and kingship should belong to the one who actually governed. With papal blessing, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian ruler and was anointed king of the Franks. This alliance between the Frankish crown and the Roman Church created a new foundation for Europe. It marked the beginning of the Carolingian dynasty, named after Pepin's father, Charles Martel. It also symbolized the birth of the idea that political and spiritual authority could strengthen one another, a concept that would shape medieval Europe for centuries. Pepin ruled wisely, reforming administration and defending the papal states in Italy against the Lombards. In gratitude, the Pope granted him the title of Patrician of the Romans. But Pepin's greatest legacy was his son, Charlemagne. Born around 742 AD, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, would become one of the most powerful and visionary rulers in European history. When Pepin died in 768, the kingdom was once again divided between his two sons, Charlemagne and Carloman. But when Carloman died suddenly a few years later, Charlemagne became sole ruler. Over the next 4 decades, he transformed the Frankish Kingdom into a vast empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube, from the North Sea to central Italy. Charlemagne's reign was one of conquest and consolidation. He campaigned tirelessly against neighboring tribes, Saxons, Lombards, Avars, and Slavs, spreading both his authority and his faith. The wars were brutal. Entire peoples were subdued and pagan shrines were destroyed as Christianity advanced. Yet Charlemagne saw himself not merely as a conqueror but as a guardian of civilization. He envisioned his empire as a continuation of Rome, reborn in the heart of Europe. In 800 AD, that vision became reality. On Christmas Day, inside St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Charlemagne knelt before the altar. As he prayed, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. The act stunned the world. The Western Roman Empire, long fallen, seemed to rise again, this time with a Frankish ruler at its head. The coronation symbolized the union of Germanic strength, Roman legacy, and Christian faith, forming the foundation of what later historians would call the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne's empire was not just built by the sword but by administration and learning. He established royal courts, standardized laws, and sent officials known as missi dominici, the king's messengers, to oversee distant provinces. He reformed currency, encouraged trade, and worked to bring order to a fragmented world. In his palace at Aachen, he built a magnificent chapel inspired by Roman architecture. It became the spiritual heart of his realm and a symbol of a new European identity. Charlemagne believed that education and faith were inseparable pillars of civilization. He gathered scholars from across Europe, Alcuin of York, Theodulf of Orleans, and others, to create what later became known as the Carolingian Renaissance. They copied ancient manuscripts, reformed Latin writing, and preserved the knowledge of Greece and Rome. The light of learning, dimmed after centuries of turmoil, flickered back to life in his court. Yet even the greatest empires depend on fragile human lives. When Charlemagne died in 814 AD, his vast realm passed to his son, Louis the Pious. Louis tried to maintain his father's legacy but faced rebellion from his own sons. After his death, the empire was divided among them in 843 by the Treaty of Verdun. This treaty is one of the most important moments in European history, for it effectively created the outlines of 3 future nations: West Francia, East Francia, and the Middle Kingdom. West Francia would evolve into modern France. East Francia became the foundation of Germany. Between them lay the contested lands of Lotharingia, modern-day Lorraine, Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern Italy. From that moment onward, the destinies of France and Germany would be forever intertwined, sometimes as allies, often as rivals. In West Francia, the Carolingian dynasty continued, but its power slowly faded. The kings lost control over distant lords who built castles and raised private armies. The unity of Charlemagne's empire dissolved into a patchwork of feudal territories, duchies, counties, and baronies, each ruled by nobles owing only nominal allegiance to the crown. The age of feudalism had begun. Despite this fragmentation, a new culture was forming. Latin evolved into the early French language, a blend of Gallo-Roman and Frankish speech. The church remained the central institution, guiding both spiritual life and education. Monasteries copied books, taught children, and offered refuge to travelers. Across the countryside, stone churches replaced wooden ones, symbolizing endurance and faith. In the north, Viking raids added new turmoil. From the late 8th century onward, Norse warriors sailed up rivers like the Seine and Loire, plundering towns and monasteries. Paris itself was besieged several times. To defend the realm, local lords grew more powerful, building fortresses and training knights. The Carolingian kings, unable to protect all their lands, granted lands and titles to those who could defend them. This system, land in exchange for military service, became the backbone of medieval Europe. One of these local lords was Rollo, a Viking chieftain who accepted baptism and land in 911 in exchange for loyalty to the Frankish king Charles the Simple. The territory granted to him became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. From these roots, Norman culture emerged, blending Norse and Frankish traditions. The Normans would later play a decisive role in shaping both France and England. By the 10th century, the Carolingian line in West Francia had nearly ended. Real power was in the hands of powerful dukes and counts. Among them, one family in particular, the Robertians, rose steadily in influence. In 987, when the last Carolingian king died without an heir, the nobles elected Hugh Capet, Duke of the Franks, as king. His coronation marked the beginning of a new dynasty, the Capetians. Hugh's power was modest at first. His authority barely extended beyond Paris and the surrounding Île-de-France. But his dynasty would endure for centuries, longer than any other in Europe. The Capetian kings built their power gradually, through marriages, alliances, and sheer patience. They understood that stability was more powerful than conquest. While kings ruled in name, the reality of medieval life was local. Castles dotted the landscape, each surrounded by villages, fields, and churches. Knights swore oaths of loyalty to lords, lords to dukes, and dukes to the king. This web of obligation defined society. The church sanctified the structure, teaching that every man had his place, those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. Yet the Middle Ages were not only an age of hierarchy, but also of creativity and resilience. Great cathedrals began to rise in stone and glass, their spires reaching toward heaven. Monks illuminated manuscripts with gold leaf, turning faith into art. Pilgrims walked across mountains and rivers to reach holy sites such as Santiago de Compostela. Towns grew around markets and trade revived. The seeds of a distinct French identity were taking root. The Capetian kings learned to use faith as a tool of unity. They strengthened ties with the church and promoted the idea of divine kingship, that the monarch ruled by the will of God. This concept gave them moral authority even when their armies were small. Over generations, through patient consolidation, France began to transform from a loose collection of fiefs into a kingdom with a shared language, faith, and purpose. But beyond its borders, powerful rivals watched. To the east lay the Holy Roman Empire. To the south, the Moors still held parts of Spain. To the west, across the Channel, England would soon emerge as a new and formidable force. The next chapter in France's story would be one of ambition, war, and transformation. As the year 1000 approached, the memory of Rome was distant, yet its shadow remained. The empire of Charlemagne had fractured, but its legacy endured in every monastery, in every Latin prayer, and in every crown forged for a king. France had not yet become the great nation it would one day be, but the foundation was set, built on faith, forged in war, and guided by the slow, steady rhythm of time. The dawn of the second millennium brought with it a slow but steady transformation. France was no longer the fragile realm of scattered lords and crumbling castles that it had been in the age of Hugh Capet. The Capetian line had survived, and with each generation, the crown gained strength, wisdom, and a sense of destiny. The early kings were cautious rulers, preferring diplomacy to war, but as their descendants rose to power, the dream of a unified France began to take shape. In the 11th and 12th centuries, feudal bonds still defined society, but cracks began to form in the old order. The church called men to arms for the Crusades, promising salvation in exchange for service in the Holy Land. From the ports of Marseille and Normandy, knights bearing the fleur-de-lis sailed across the Mediterranean, fighting under the banner of the cross. These crusades not only spread faith but also opened new paths of trade and knowledge. Returning crusaders brought back spices, fabrics, and ideas from the East, enriching French towns and awakening curiosity about the wider world. It was during this era that a new kind of power began to emerge, not only the power of the sword, but of the mind. Cathedrals rose higher, universities were founded, and philosophy flourished. In Paris, the University of the Sorbonne became a beacon of learning. The city itself grew into a cultural heart of Europe, where scholars debated theology and artisans built masterpieces in stone and glass. Notre Dame Cathedral began to rise above the Seine, its towers a symbol of both faith and the growing pride of a people who began to call themselves distinctly French. The Capetian kings continued to consolidate authority. Philip I and Louis VI, known as Louis the Fat, began reasserting royal control over rebellious nobles. But it was Louis VII and his ambitious wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who pushed the monarchy into the complex web of European politics. Their marriage united vast territories, stretching from the Loire Valley to the Pyrenees. Yet love and loyalty proved fragile. Their union dissolved, and Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, who soon became King of England. With that marriage, the English crown gained possession of half of France. The seeds of centuries-long conflict were sown. By the time Philip II, known as Philip Augustus, took the throne in 1180, the balance of power was shifting. He was a shrewd, determined monarch who understood that the survival of France depended on breaking the hold of the English kings over French soil. Through strategy, alliances, and decisive battles, Philip reclaimed much of the territory lost to England. In 1214, his victory at the Battle of Bouvines united the nobles behind him and secured his place as one of France's greatest medieval kings. It was a moment that transformed France from a loose feudal kingdom into a centralized monarchy. Philip's successors continued this work. Louis IX, remembered as Saint Louis, ruled not only with authority but with conscience. His reign in the 13th century marked the height of medieval France's moral and cultural power. He reformed justice, ensuring that even the poorest could appeal directly to the king. He sponsored the building of the Sainte-Chapelle, a radiant jewel of Gothic art, created to house relics of Christ's Passion. Louis's piety and fairness made him a model of Christian kingship, admired across Europe. Yet power breeds envy, and the ambitions of kings often collide. Under Philip IV, Philip the Fair, the crown clashed with the papacy itself. Philip sought to tax the church's wealth to fund his wars, leading to a bitter dispute with Pope Boniface VIII. In a bold move, Philip influenced the election of a new pope and even relocated the papal court to Avignon in southern France. For nearly 70 years, the popes would remain there under the watchful eye of French kings. It was a time known as the Avignon papacy, a symbol of both France's dominance and the growing cracks in Christendom's unity. Meanwhile, the Plantagenet kings of England, descendants of Eleanor and Henry, still held vast territories in France. Tensions simmered between the two crowns, each claiming sovereignty over the same lands. The situation reached its breaking point in 1337, when King Edward III of England asserted his claim to the French throne through his mother, Isabella of France. The French rejected his claim, crowning Philip VI instead. Thus began one of the longest and most devastating conflicts in European history, the 100 Years' War. The war would rage for over a century, not continuously, but in waves of battles, truces, and betrayals. It was fought not only for crowns and borders, but for identity itself. At first, English armies, led by commanders like Edward the Black Prince, seemed unstoppable. Their longbowmen decimated French knights at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356. France descended into chaos. The king was captured, and peasants rose in desperate revolt. For decades, the land was ravaged by war, famine, and plague. In the midst of this darkness, a figure emerged who would change the course of history. In 1429, a young peasant girl from Domremy claimed to hear divine voices urging her to save France. Her name was Joan of Arc. At a time when hope had nearly vanished, she convinced the Dauphin, Charles, the rightful heir to the throne, to let her lead his troops. Dressed in armor and carrying a white banner, she inspired soldiers with faith that their cause was just. Under her command, the French lifted the siege of Orléans and turned the tide of war. Joan's courage and conviction shocked the world. She led Charles to Reims, where he was crowned King Charles VII, fulfilling her prophecy. But her triumph was short-lived. Captured by the Burgundians, allies of England, she was handed over to her enemies. In 1431, at the age of 19, she was tried for heresy and burned at the stake in Rouen. Her final words, spoken as flames consumed her, were prayers to God. Her death was meant to break France's spirit, but instead, it became its salvation. Joan of Arc's martyrdom united a fractured nation. Over the following decades, Charles VII reorganized the army, reformed taxes, and reclaimed lost territories. By 1453, the war was effectively over. The English held only Calais, and France stood free and whole once more. The 100 Years' War had forged a new sense of identity. No longer merely a patchwork of fiefs, France had become a nation bound by language, faith, and shared destiny. The late 15th and early 16th centuries ushered in the Renaissance, and France embraced it with vigor. Under kings like Francis I, art, science, and humanism flourished. Leonardo da Vinci spent his final years at the French court, bringing with him the genius of Italy's golden age. French architecture blended Gothic grandeur with Renaissance elegance. Castles like Chambord and Chenonceau rose along the Loire, symbols of beauty and power. Paris became a center of intellect, drawing thinkers, artists, and explorers. But the world beyond Europe was changing. Across the Atlantic, new continents had been discovered. The age of discovery opened new routes, riches, and rivalries. France joined the race for empire, sending explorers like Jacques Cartier to North America in search of new lands and trade. Though centuries had passed since the days of Clovis, the spirit of exploration and ambition remained alive in the heart of France. At home, the monarchy continued to grow in strength. But beneath the surface, tension brewed. The Reformation spread across Europe, dividing nations along lines of faith. France, deeply Catholic but with a growing Protestant minority, fell into religious wars. From 1562 to 1598, Catholics and Huguenots fought in brutal conflicts that tore the kingdom apart. The horror reached its peak during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, when thousands of Protestants were slain in Paris and beyond. Amid this chaos rose a man of both courage and pragmatism, Henry of Navarre. A Protestant by birth, he converted to Catholicism to secure peace, famously declaring, "Paris is well worth a mass." As King Henry IV, he issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting religious tolerance and ending decades of bloodshed. His reign restored stability and prosperity, planting the seeds for the France of the modern age. By the early 1600s, France stood as one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Its culture, language, and courtly life became models for others to emulate. Under Cardinal Richelieu and later Louis XIV, the Sun King, royal power reached its zenith. The dream that began with Clovis's baptism, that grew under Charlemagne's crown, and that endured through centuries of war and faith, had finally taken shape. France had become not merely a land or a people, but an idea, a symbol of civilization itself. As history moved forward, France would face revolutions, empires, and rebirths. But every chapter, every victory and tragedy traced its roots back to those ancient beginnings: the Franks, the Merovingians, the Carolingians, the Capetians. From the ashes of Rome to the fires of Joan of Arc, from the halls of Aachen to the cathedrals of Paris, the story of France was written not in ink, but in courage, endurance, and faith. And as the last echoes of the Middle Ages faded into the dawn of the modern world, one truth remained constant: nations, like people, are born not in a single moment but across generations of struggle and hope. France, shaped by kings and saints, warriors and dreamers, stood as a testament to that journey. A land that had begun as a patchwork of tribes and had become, through centuries of trials, the beating heart of Europe.